Hello, my name is Alexander Solozhin. I am an RA here at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. For our War Observatory project, we are conducting a series of interviews with experts in various academic fields relevant to the war in Ukraine. In this series, we cover basic and advanced subject matters relevant to the war. We intend for these videos to be used as teaching materials for faculty and students in Canada and around the world. Joining me here today to answer a few questions regarding how countries in Central Asia and the Caucasus regard the war in Ukraine is Dr. Jeff Sahadeo. Dr. Jeff Sahadeo is a professor at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and Political Science at Carleton University. He is author of Voices from the Soviet Edge and Russian Colonial Society in Tashkent, 1865 to 1923. He is also co-editor of Everyday Life in Central Asia. His teaching interests include diaspora, migration, and empire in Europe and Eurasia. He also works on issues of colonialism, nationality, frontiers and borders and relations of power, the creation of identities and states, and daily life. His current project examines the intersection between rivers and societies in Tsarist and Soviet Georgia. So beginning with the basic questions, up until the beginning of the war, what was the relationship like between Russia and the countries of Central Asia and the Caucasus? And what was this relationship like with Ukraine?
Thanks, Alex, for the question, and thanks to our audience for listening. Obviously, this is a vast region, Caucasus and Central Asia. We're talking about 8 states here, so there's no one answer to that. But I would say overall, all of these countries have had to understand and deal with the fact that Russia is still a very important player in their neighborhood, whether they like it or not. And they have been careful to try and maintain some level of multi-vector foreign policy. And I think you would say that's almost universal for every state. Russia has a certain advantage in that it has supplied energy to all of these states. Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are a little bit better off, Turkmenistan too. The other countries are more energy dependent. But regardless of that, Russia also has cultural links. A lot of these leaders who are currently in power in the region, and certainly the first decade or two after the end of the Soviet Union, were educated in Moscow and Leningrad. They were as comfortable, if not more comfortable, in Russian language than their regional languages, obviously a bit more in Central Asia and the Caucasus. So it's been this delicate dance of trying to deal with a former, and what they would consider, I think many would consider, not all, a former imperial power, but at the same time, one that they've been so linked to economically, socially, and that has a lot of resources that are critical to the region's growth. So in Central Asia, for example, you have a lot of the more poor countries, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan especially, but also Uzbekistan, sending many labor migrants up to Russia, or many of these people are going on their own. The state is somewhat encouraging them because the economies are so poor, and remittances coming back are really critical. This happens in Azerbaijan as well. Also, you have in the Caucasus, Azerbaijan has sent labor migrants, even Georgia has. Armenia becomes very dependent strategically on Russia because Armenia and Azerbaijan have been involved in a war, and Russia also is playing kind of its own geopolitical game. So really, it's a question of all of these states is in their own self-interest, right? They're all acting to try and decide, okay, how can we deal with Russia that allows us to keep some of these benefits, and whether that benefit be energy supplies, allowing themselves to send labor migrants to Russia. In some cases, they're joining something called the Eurasian Union, which is a body that Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are part of. In some cases, you're joining different security alliances. Georgia is the one country that has really tried to distance itself, but of course, then Russia has occupied Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Russian tourist money is important for them. So Russia is always in the minds and calculations of all of these countries. And with a mixed reactions too. I sort of talk about Russia being an imperial power, but again, a lot of these people, even younger people, are comfortable with Russian culture, right? They get Russian television stations, they listen to Russian music and things like that. So it's a mixed bag, and with Ukraine, it's become a very complicating factor now. In the past, I think with Crimea, I think with a lot of Western countries too, right? There was an initial reaction to the Russian invasion of Crimea, and it went relatively quickly, so it didn't alter foreign policy. But then with the Orange Revolution in Crimea, which was sort of echoed in Georgia and then in Kyrgyzstan later, Ukraine has acted as a bit of a testing ground to sort of see what Russia would or wouldn't do in this region, rather than necessarily Ukraine on its own being particularly important. And a lot of these countries have different level relationships with, say, Russian business people or Russian/Ukrainian business people who are in Ukraine. But they watch Ukraine to signal what might happen to them, what Russia is doing. And so when Russia moved into Crimea, there was a sort of instant kind of freeze, wondering, is this going to be the end? And it was the end for that stage. Now it's far more serious, of course.
And this kind of flows into my next question. And how have the countries of Central Asia and the Caucasus, how have they reacted to the war in Ukraine? Are there certain states that support it and certain which not as much?
Yeah, it's been, again, a really fascinating thing to watch, and a very mixed bag, and not always in ways that we would have expected. For example, Georgia, which you would expect to be the one country that would be the most opposed to Russia invading, because Georgia is occupied, parts of Georgia are occupied, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And Georgia has had by far the most pro-European, pro-NATO stance, and they were invaded in 2008 in part because there was some movement towards them joining NATO. But their government is basically been captured by an oligarch with sort of shadowy ties to Russian business. And their government does not have a good relationship with Zelensky at all, because Zelensky has supported Mikhail Saakashvili, who's actually one of the major opposition parties to Georgia. So the Georgians have kind of stayed out of it as a government, even though the population has been very much anti-war. And so I was just in Tbilisi, and you see anti-war signs, pro-Ukraine signs everywhere. But the government has not, has actually made a point of saying that we don't want to be dragged into war with Russia, and there's this fear of that. Armenia Armenia and Azerbaijan are also sort of trapped in this sense where now that Ukraine has been invaded, it's unclear what Russia's status in the Caucasus is going to be. Are the Russians going to be as engaged? So they used to be the ones who were mediating the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, the mountainous territory that was part of Azerbaijan, but taken over by Armenia and now is independent territory that largely populated by ethnic Armenians, that was a cause of a war a couple of years back. And now Russia has, no, I wouldn't say withdrawn from it, but they've kind of lost their interest in mediating that conflict. So Europe has stepped in. Armenia and Georgia both have large numbers of Russian migrants who are there, some of whom are fleeing the war for political reasons, economic reasons, others who are just there because they want to avoid sanctions and they want to continue on maybe a nicer life. So for Georgia, it's this balancing act again, and very different feelings between the government and the population. Armenia and Azerbaijan, I think there is a sense that engagement with Europe is now more important, in fact. And they're taking advantage of an opportunity with a Russian tension turned away. Certainly the EU is desperate to get Azerbaijani gas and oil right now, now that they know they may not be able to rely on Russian oil, and the EU maybe might help an Armenia-Azerbaijan peace agreement. That seems to be the case. So their main worry is sort of trying to deal with this Armenia-Azerbaijan issue, and the Russians who are coming to Armenia, who actually, even though their presence is driving up real estate values a lot, given the damage to the Armenian economy in the war a couple of years ago, the Russians are bringing money in. So there's a very mixed sense in Armenia about how to deal with them. In Central Asia, it's even more interesting because I think the Russians felt that Central Asia would be on side, because the Central Asians have traditionally had a more they're part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes Russia and China and many of the Central Asian states. The Central Asian states have been a little bit more reticent to distance themselves. But even a few weeks after the invasion, the Uzbek foreign minister claimed that they wouldn't recognize this territory that Russia had taken over as Russian. Now he was eventually removed from his position, probably because Moscow was quite angry about that. But I think as a whole, the Central Asian populations are anxious. If Russia can invade, this goes to the Caucasus populations, if Russia's going to invade Ukraine, where do they go next? Right? And Kazakhstan is really fascinating because just a few weeks ago, the Kazakh president was at the World Economic Forum in St. Petersburg and basically took an anti-Russian position and contradicted the Russians on the legitimacy of the invasion of Ukraine. And Kazakhstan can very clearly worry that the northern areas of Kazakhstan, which are populated by a lot of ethnic Russians, could be the next place that Russia goes, right? Maybe Moldova first, but so even though there was actually a sense that the Russians might get support from Kazakhstan, not only like support politically, but they were hoping Kazakhstan might, like Belarus, even help militarily, because Russia had just helped the Kazakhs put down an uprising in January of 2022. The Kazakhs have not done that, and now they are signaling that they're not so interested in this supporting Russia in any way in this war. But it's a delicate dance for all of them. And I think some of them are exploiting the Russian weakness because they know now, right, that the Russians don't have the focus, but they also know in the long term that the Russians clearly have crossed this Rubicon into an actual invasion, an unprovoked invasion of another territory where there are ethnic Russians in some kind of pro-imperial move. So, but at the same time, so many of these countries still depend on Russia. I mean, the Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan still send their labor migrants there, and Russia still, in terms of the economic heft. But I think what has happened so far, just in the last couple of months, is it's accelerated this multi-vector foreign policy and allowed in the Caucasus more space for the EU, in Central Asia more space for China, even more than before, or even the US or the European Union in those areas too. So and then populations have divisions. The Uzbeks get bombarded. A lot of them watch Russian television, right? A lot of Russian propaganda channels. The Uzbek government just came out last week saying that they were seriously going to punish any Uzbeks who were going to enroll in the war on Russia's side, because a lot of Uzbek labor migrants in Russia have been talking about going, and they're being recruited now by the Russian military to go. So many really interesting facets to this. But I think in the end, in the short term, these areas are trying to explore what will happen if Russia is somewhat weakened and their attention is placed elsewhere, and put in place some strategies in case Russia does turn their eyes to them in the future.
And now many Russians have emigrated to countries of Central Asia and the Caucasus following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Which countries exactly have most of these immigrants gone to, and how has this affected everyday life in those countries?
Yeah, they have spread out. I think Georgia and Armenia have had the highest numbers, smaller numbers in Azerbaijan. There's clusters in Uzbekistan, they tend to go to the major cities, so Tashkent and Bishkek. In Georgia, Tbilisi, which is the capital, and there's the shore city of Batumi, which is close, and the Russians have a lot of links to. In terms of everyday life, I just mentioned, and we were talking earlier about rents going up, and I think that probably is the most pointed example of an effect on everyday life, especially in Tbilisi and Yerevan and Batumi, those three cities. And we do hear stories of, on the one hand, it was interesting, Russians coming in and offering money for apartments, and landlords started to kick people like lower income people out, students out, that rents at kind of the lower level that people in lower incomes were living in have doubled or tripled in the last 6 months. So we do have a significant impact there. And then a lot of Georgians shaming their countrymen people who are kicking out other Georgians to allow Russians to come in. So there has been a backlash against this. But beyond that, it's been interesting. I was in Tbilisi for a couple of months, and there was a rally shortly before I arrived against the presence of Russians in Tbilisi. And by that time, there were about 35,000 Russians in Tbilisi, the government estimated. They stopped publishing estimates. I don't think they really want to track it and give reason for people to oppose it. But colleagues who I spoke to said that Tbilisi has, like, unlike, say, the Baltic states, Tbilisi has always had a pretty decent accommodation with Russians who've gone there. They don't always like a number of Russian tourists who are there, because Russian tourists tend to be like our image of American tourists. They're quite loud. They kind of feel it's their territory. But at the same time, they realize that they're in this sphere. And I would say many of the Russians who are there now, who have fled, are trying to integrate themselves. They're learning the Georgian language. I met people who were from environmental groups. They made up little Facebook groups so that if Georgians say, "Oh, we find a pile of garbage somewhere," or there's some issue, that these groups will come. So for every Russian who's there speaking loudly in Russian, being somewhat offensive, there's another Russian who is, and also it's hard to tell because many Ukrainians speak Russian too, obviously, who's trying to integrate themselves. There's a lot of anti-Russian graffiti around Tbilisi, that's for sure. There's sort of graffiti wars. There'll be these signs saying F Russia, F Russians, and then somebody will cross it out and saying F Putin, right? And there's this effort to try and figure out, is it all Russians who are to blame, or is it Putin and the regime? I mentioned in Yerevan, it's this mixed feeling because the Russians are bringing money to the economy. In Central Asia too, the numbers aren't substantial enough to have really moved the dial. And in the capital cities in Central Asia, more than the Caucasus, it's easier to speak Russian, for example. So these people might not necessarily be that easy, and there's fewer of them. They may not necessarily be that easy to pick apart from some of the local Russians. There are fewer and fewer who are there. So we would have thought that this wave, I think a few months ago, was going to be more problematic in terms of local reaction. But I think the way that a good number of Russians have tried to integrate themselves and to make a point of being very public that they are trying to help the societies that they're in. Also, many of them shuttle around, so you can't fly to Tbilisi. They fly from Moscow to Yerevan. They go to Tbilisi, and they then sometimes will try and go to Europe or go to Germany. And of course, most of these people are older or women, right? There are not a lot of young men because the Russians are not letting them out, and especially now. So they tend to not be maybe particularly as I don't want to say obnoxious, but sort of, hanging around. And the one complaint I got from some people in Tbilisi was the bars and restaurants were getting crowded, and late at night the Russians were coming out. But the fact that there aren't as many young men might quell that a little bit. But it definitely is something to watch, and then to see how this Russian influence goes. And Russians, it's very easy to do business in Tbilisi. On the one hand, all the Russians need to do is file basically a form saying they're operating a business and they can bring their assets there. But on the other hand, some banks are asking them to sign these forms that they oppose the war, which could become very problematic for Russians who are there. But and when Russians tell their story too, I met some Russians when I was in Tbilisi. One Russian professor who has fled. And the questions that she often gets asked is, well, you're Russian, you should be at home, you should be fighting your own government, and really that's the best way for you to end this war. And she said, look, if it was just a matter of getting a 15-day prison sentence, I would do it. I would protest, I would risk going to prison. But if it's a 15-year prison sentence, right, and some people are getting those, that's a bit different. And I think when people think about that, I think they get some sympathy.
And I just have a question that you've mentioned before that countries in Central Asia and the Caucasus are highly dependent on Russia economically. Would you say that it's also the case that Russia itself is highly dependent on some of the cheap labor that is coming from those countries? Would you say that perhaps gives those countries some degree of leverage, I suppose?
Yeah, I think definitely that either Russians don't want to admit it, but certainly now, given how many people they're sending to the front, right? A lot of young, and given this war looks like it's going to be going on, and given that they're starting to recruit these labor migrants for their military, right? That's really interesting, and that's just started to happen. It will allow more leverage for these groups, and it's unclear, of course, what's going to happen to the Russian economy in the next months. But I think it's one of these shifts that Russia has already incurred such costs, and it's hard to tell, obviously, how this war is going to end. But no matter what, in the short term, probably medium term, they are going to be weakened as a regional actor, and it allows these states a bit more leverage to continue this multipolar aspect, and whether it be China, Europe, even the United States, the Russians are not going to have the same tools to counter that, especially if they do need that labor. And who knows? And if this war ends up with them occupying large areas of Ukraine, they'll need to well, who knows, right? But you'd think that they would need to reconstruct them. And they're going to need this labor, and the demographic issues that were already there are only going to be worse.
Thank you so much for meeting with me today and answering all my questions.
You're very welcome, Alex.